So picking right back up where we left off, we're going to finish out the rest of the journal entries and then deal with that overhead account that has that weird balance in it right now. So cost of goods manufactured is the cost of the good that we manufactured. It's the cost of all of the jobs that we completed or finished during the period. So this is the cost that we're going to debit to finished goods inventory to move it into to increase that asset account. And we're going to credit work in process to move it out of to decrease that asset account. So we're going to debit finished goods inventory and credit work in process. So now you've got your T accounts drawn here. You have your finished goods T account, which currently has a zero balance. It had zero beginning balance, and we want to debit it for $644,600. And then you've got your work in process T account over here that has lots of debits. It had a beginning balance of 80, and then you added your direct materials and your direct labor and the overhead that we allocated, and now I'm going to credit it for $644,600. So that's the amount that I'm moving out of work in process into finished goods inventory. So now we're told that when we sell the goods, we're going to sell the jobs for $1,200,000 and they have a cost of $584,600. Okay, so we learned back in financial accounting, every time we sell something, we're going to make two journal entries. The first one is to record the sale. So we'll debit cash or accounts receivable for the $1,200,000. And then we will move that job out of finished goods inventory into cost of goods sold. So I want to debit cost of goods sold, credit finished goods inventory for this $584,600. So now if I look at my T accounts, notice the balance in work in process is $27,000. This is the job that I'm still working on. The balance in finished goods inventory is $60,000. These are the jobs that are still, they are finished, but they're waiting to sell to the customer. And then cost of goods sold is where ultimately all of the process costs, all the product costs end up. All the manufacturing costs ultimately wind up into cost of goods sold. So this is a great tip down here that I want to point out. It's a lot easier to think of if the transfer to account is what you're going to debit. The transfer from account is what you're going to credit. So when we're transferring into finished goods, we'll debit finished goods. We're transferring out of work in process, we'll credit work in process. Same thing when we're transferring to cost of goods sold, we'll debit cost of goods sold. We're moving out of finished goods, so we credit finished goods. So now let's go back to that overhead account. If you remember, that overhead account on the debit side had all of the actual overhead amounts, and then the credit side had the allocate or applied side or applied amounts. In our example, we wound up with a debit balance because the actual side was larger. So that means that we had under allocated overhead. The actual costs were more than the amount that we had allocated. So this is when you end up with a debit balance. If we had over allocated, then that means that the credit, the allocated side, would have been larger than the debit actual side, and we would have had a credit balance. So in our example, again, we had a debit balance, so that means we had under allocated. We had not allocated enough. We should have allocated 83. We didn't. We only allocated 67.6. So what this means is when we completed our jobs during the year, we only applied 67,600 of overhead to those jobs. We really should have applied 83,000. So those jobs that are in cost of goods sold, because that's ultimately where they all wind up, they're really too cheap. they're more expensive than that. That 584,600 is really too low. They actually cost us more than that. Okay. So in this case, in this example, since we have a debit balance in overhead, I want to close overhead. Overhead is not an account that I can carry forward to next year on my balance sheet. There's not stuff in it that I can carry forward. This is the depreciation and the property taxes and the insurance. I can't carry that forward. I have to zero this account out. So in this example, since overhead has a debit balance, I want to credit it to zero it out. So I'm going to do a journal entry to credit overhead for 15.4 so that it will have a zero balance. So then since I have to credit overhead, the account that I will debit is going to be cost of goods sold, because cost of goods sold is ultimately where all of the costs wind up. So by debiting cost of goods sold, I am increasing that account to say, hey, these jobs were really more expensive than I previously recorded them at. So now if I look at my overhead T account, it has a zero balance. Cost of goods sold is now correctly at 600,000 because that's how much these goods actually cost to produce. Now, before I end the chapter, I just want to point out what would happen if we had over allocated. So I'm just going to draw down here at the bottom real quick. So just pretend with me, we have our overhead T account. I'm just making numbers up here, but pretend with me that allocated overhead was 80,000 and actual overhead was 60,000. So in this case, I would have a $20,000 credit balance. This would be over allocated. I allocated too much. So then to close overhead, I would want to debit overhead. So it would be zero. So my journal entry then would be to debit overhead and credit cost of goods sold. In this case for 20,000. So when I credit cost of goods sold, I'm decreasing that account. So if I go over here to my cost of goods sold, let's just say that it's still 584,600. But I come in here and I credit it for 60,000. I said, you know what? 584,600 is really too expensive. Those jobs were actually cheaper to produce than I originally recorded them at. They were really 564,600. So this mechanism self-corrects. It makes sure that no matter how off our estimates were, and hey, we estimated this last year. It's been like 18 months by now. It's no wonder that we didn't get it exactly correct. That's okay. But we're going to fix it now, and we're going to make sure that cost of goods sold is the actual correct amount.